Imagine you wake up tomorrow, and your money is still there. Your balances still show up on a screen. Your reserves still exist on paper, but you can't move them. You can't spend them. You can't settle a trade. You can't pay a supplier. You can't pay your soldiers. You can't even pay interest on your own debt. Not because your country ran out of money, because someone switched off your access to the network. That is what modern sanctions can do. Wars used to be fought with armies. Now they're fought with payment rails. When a country is sanctioned, it doesn't just lose trade. It can lose access to its banks, its reserves, and its future. And that's why the dollar isn't just a currency. It's a gate. This is the kind of power you don't see on a battlefield. You see it in compliance departments, in clearing systems, in custody accounts. Because in the 21st century, money isn't a thing. Money is a network, and sanctions are the off switch. Most people think international payments work like email. You send money, it arrives, done. But that's not how it works. Cross-border money moves through a chain of permissions. Here are the 3 layers people confuse. 1. Messaging. SWIFT. SWIFT is often described like the system that moves money. It doesn't move money. It sends instructions, messages between banks about who should pay whom. It's the courier, not the vault. 2. Correspondent banking, the real bridge. If your bank in country A wants to pay someone in dollars in country B, it usually needs a U.S. correspondent bank. This is where leverage appears. Because correspondent banks can refuse service, and if they refuse, your payments don't fail. They never even begin. 3. Clearing and settlement, where the money becomes final. Settlement is where the payment is final, where balances actually change in official systems. And in dollars, final settlement tends to orbit U.S. infrastructure and U.S.-connected institutions. You can't be outside the dollar system and still use the dollar. To use it at scale, you touch the rails. And the rails have choke points. This didn't start as a weapon. It started as an order. After World War II, the U.S. emerged with unmatched industrial capacity, political reach, and financial credibility. The dollar became the anchor of global trade and finance. Over decades, global banking standardized around dollar-denominated trade, dollar reserves, and dollar settlement. The world didn't just adopt the dollar as a currency. It adopted the dollar's plumbing as a standard. Once that plumbing became universal, the U.S. gained network power. If global money flows through your standards, your institutions, and your legal jurisdiction, then access becomes conditional. And conditional access becomes a weapon, not because the U.S. has to seize everything, but because it can force the world to choose. Access to the dollar network or access to the target. So how does the weapon actually work? Not with one button. Try it with several choke points stacked together. 1. Reserve assets aren't in a vault. Most are in custody. Reserves, held as securities and deposits in foreign institutions, custodians, clearinghouses, depositories. That means reserves can be immobilized without tanks and without bombs. All it takes is a legal prohibition. No transactions, no transfers, no sales, no coupons, no settlement. Your reserves still exist, but you can't use them. 2. Clearing choke points, the dollar gatekeepers. Even if 2 non-U.S. parties are trading, dollar payments often touch U.S. infrastructure. Enforcement doesn't need to police every transaction on Earth. It needs to police the narrow points where transactions become final. That's why compliance matters more than headlines. The real power is making legitimate institutions too afraid to process anything close to the line. 3. Compliance as a force multiplier. Banks don't want fines, criminal risk, or to lose access to U.S. markets, so they overcomply. De-risking, banks withdrawing correspondent relationships, shrinking access for regions and sectors. The weapon isn't just the law, it's the fear of losing the network. 4. Secondary sanctions, forcing third parties to choose. That turns the dollar network into a global loyalty test. It doesn't require global consensus. It requires global dependence. Case File 1, Iran and the SWIFT cutoff. In 2012, Iranian banks were disconnected from SWIFT. That didn't just make payments slower. It made payments impossible at scale. Trade finance collapses when banks can't communicate, clear, and settle normally. Banking isolation becomes economic isolation. SWIFT became a household word. Briefly, centralized network becomes weapon. Case File 2. Russia's Reserve Freeze. In 2022, a much bigger precedent was set. A major power had reserves immobilized abroad, foundation of state finance. Estimates place immobilized assets in the hundreds of billions, held in Europe, institutions like Euroclear. New concept of war, deny access. Freeze settlement capacity. You can turn a nation into a forced cash economy overnight, cut off from the global bloodstream. A weapon this powerful always creates a reaction. The world doesn't de-dollarize overnight. It diversifies around the edges. Countries look for alternatives, gold, swap lines, local currencies. Not because it's better. Because dependence is a vulnerability. Alternative rails grow. Systems like China's SIPs expand. Reality check. SWIFT is global. Alternatives are regional, still interoperate. Near-term outcome isn't replacement. It's fragmentation. More routes, more barriers, trusted and untrusted blocks, higher costs, slower flows. De-risking becomes collateral damage. Global banks pull back. Even countries not targeted can lose access. Network becomes more selective. Blowback isn't only geopolitical. It's developmental. When payment access shrinks, trade shrinks. Investment shrinks. Growth shrinks. From the U.S. perspective, sanctions are attractive. No boots, no body bags, just pressure. But there's a trade-off. Every time you use the network as a weapon, you teach the world the network is a weapon. That doesn't mean the dollar collapses tomorrow. Trust becomes conditional. Reserves become political. Settlement becomes strategic. Allies ask, could this be used on us? Be smart. Neutral countries ask, how do we reduce exposure? Warned. Targets ask, how do we survive outside the rails? The dollar's power comes from adoption. Adoption comes from trust. Long-term question isn't, can sanctions hurt? They can. The long-term question is, how many times can you weaponize the gate before the world starts building side doors? We began with a simple nightmare. Your money exists, but you can't touch it. That's not science fiction. That's what happens when currency becomes infrastructure, and infrastructure becomes policy. The dollar is not just paper. It's not just interest rates. It's a network of clearing, custody, correspondent banking, and compliance. When that network is centralized, it becomes powerful. When it becomes powerful, it becomes tempting to weaponize. If money is a network, sanctions are the off switch. In the new Cold War, the battlefield isn't always a border. Sometimes it's a payment rail. If this gave you a new perspective, subscribe. History has the answers. I'll show you where to look.